Welcome to the Operator's Dilemma, where we go behind the scenes to share insights from the best builders and operators in tech. Today, I'm joined by Matt Heist, who's had some incredible roles through the years. I'll share a few highlights here. He spent 7 years in the heydays of Yahoo from 2000 to 2007, serving as Director of Business Development, Vice President of Finance Operations, and GM of Yahoo Shopping. And most recently wrapped up a 7-year run with Slack from 2015 to 2022, joining as one of the first 150 employees and served as the Vice President of Finance and BizOps, where he grew the team from 1 to over 70 in his 7-year career there. During that time, Matt's team helped guide the company through some amazing milestones, including several private fundraising events, a direct listing in 2019, and the acquisition of Slack to Salesforce for $28 billion in 2021. I'm a little out of breath. Quite an impressive journey, Matt. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for that intro. Yeah, that's being a little generous on some of those kudos, but thank you.
Yeah, I knew you wouldn't take it, so I had to write it in for you. I thought a helpful place to start the conversation might be to begin with the end in mind a bit and with a phrase that folks are kind of familiar with, which is this concept of earning a seat at the table. And that's something that finance and operations folks across the industry talk a lot about, but sometimes it's difficult to put meaning behind that. It's something we reference in the blog post that we're chatting about here today. Maybe we could just start with how you would define earning a seat at the table and why you think it's so challenging for teams to achieve.
Yeah, sure. I think just over the years out here, I've seen different iterations of finance teams, FP&A, BizOps, and that always has been an underlying question is how do you become that team that's a little more than just give me the numbers? And, in one metaphor is earning a seat at the table. For us and what we've seen, it's a little counterintuitive, but it actually starts with really getting in the weeds early on and being, quite frankly, tactical initially. There's a strategic bent and an end game for sure, but delivering on those initial tactics. And from that perspective, when you go to some of these companies, oftentimes you'll have a leadership team or an ELT that has come from larger companies and they're used to robust reporting, deep insights and analysis, but from those mature companies. And so when you're at a younger company, a finance team, and ultimately maybe we expand that to biz ops or strategy and ops, whatever you'd like to call it. One great first step that always seems to pave the way to that seat at the table is just do the basics, get them their headcount, cut that headcount in different ways, set it up in a pivot table so they can figure out exactly who's on their team, what they're doing, help build a forecast. And those sound somewhat simple, but if you start to build that forecast, you start to really understand what drives the business. And before you know it, as opposed to just reporting on the business, people start to ask you some questions. I think early on, some of those deliverables have a much more profound impact than people can even understand. If you have to raise money, someone has to say, what are you going to do with that money? And before you know it, someone's going to say, well, what do we get for that money? And before you know it, there comes a forecast. And so early on, earning that seat at the table, again, somewhat counterintuitive, but it actually starts with a little bit more being in the weeds on some projects. Even though you know larger picture where you want to head to, where you want to go, starting down there can help sometimes.
Next, I wanted to start with a little bit of a kind of funny story that you had shared with me before. We are familiar with this ideal end state of earning a seat at the table, but sometimes folks jump in too eagerly in other directions. And you sort of described a situation where leaders throughout the company would say someone might need a Matt talk. I'll put that in air quotes here. Can you tell us a little bit about what that conversation entailed and why you sort of became the talent whisperer for folks in that regard?
Yeah, maybe I oversold that a little to you. That sounds a little narcissistic, but really what that was about was particularly building our team or a finance team. Often you'd hire just whip smart folks from an investment bank or a consulting firm. And many times they were doing some really interesting work, building out this kind of castle analysis and levering and unlevering betas and trying to value the NOLs and a P&L. And they brought that to the table and just, showed up thinking, okay, this is what we're going to work on. And there were moments where you had to take a step back and say, look, we're going to get there. But right now what I need is a pivot table for headcount, or we need to figure out what last quarter's revenue was and try to translate that into the next quarter's revenue. And so there's just a moment in time, I think, where folks coming from a little less experience and maybe from some service industries where they show up at a company and they don't realize initially, gosh, we are really crawling before we run here. And we're the team that probably has to do that. And so there's a little bit of an eye-opening experience. And again, I think if you tee it up as, hey, these are early, this is not what's expected for your job here forever. But initially, we've all got to hold hands and just kind of clean some things up and or build some things from 0 to 1 before we get into some of those, bigger wins on the board that I think folks might come in initially thinking is what they're working on.
Yeah, a profound realization for me when I made the transition from investment banking to working internally at a startup was in banking, you sort of started with the answers that management would provide you, and then you had the sort of opportunity to do any of these analysis you needed to. It's almost the inverse is true, especially at earlier stage companies where you don't even know what the sort of starting point is. Like, let's get that V1 data and make sure it's right and stress test it before we can do some of these more sophisticated analyses. Did that kind of resonate with you?
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, when we were at a bank a long time ago, you would receive the numbers that were the actuals. Oftentimes they were audited. They had an initial shot at forecast. You would receive those as the banker, and then you'd go to work with that and try to build it out to 11 years and terminal values and terminal growth rates. And what you didn't realize when you joined the company is that didn't just happen. There was not a group that just kind of put that together. That's you. And that's a little bit of it's certainly not a comeuppance. It's just a little bit of a realization that this thing, I hate to keep saying it, but you really do have to take it from 0 to 1 to even just get those basics in place to then work on some of them, perhaps more the intellectually curious things as you get out there a little bit further.
In sort of that process of getting to the very fundamental building blocks, you learn so much about the business and how it operates in a way to like work through the sort of stepping stone of I can't go through that until I master the basics, and that's what's going to inform how I do those higher order projects as well.
I think that's right. And I think the forecast model to me is often that connector of dots or source of truth, where as opposed to multiplying the last quarter on 1.2 for 20% growth, people will just start to say, well, wait, what's driving this thing? And, if you can show them a few early on, very simple KPIs that might drive it, enormously helpful. And then as life goes on, hopefully does become a little more complex. But that process, to your point, is just vital to really learn the basics of the business, especially on the top line. But you can also see it in some of the expenses and, the age old questions you'll get when at a board meeting and someone says, well, what do I get if we give you 50 more heads? What kind of growth do I get? Those aren't easy questions to answer. And there is no perfect answer, but having a partner who knows the business and knows that headcount cold and knows that top line model cold, it's a great partner to have.
Matt, could you just give us a quick walkthrough of the hierarchy we put together that's sort of built across the three stages of fundamentals, trust, and partnership, and earning a seat at the table? What are those stages? What do they sort of mean to you?
Yeah. So I know now it's in boxes and it looks very clean. I would argue it was somewhat chaotic to get here, but it sure looks clean now in the way you put it together working with me. So that's great. But fundamentals, I think we used the reference to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but this is kind of food, shelter, clothing. So this is where oftentimes you'll first show up and there's very minimal in place about a budget, where heads are sitting, what groups they're in, how much we're spending. And so really a fundamental piece to the puzzle is building out that budget. You'll see there are a few boxes here. Our group did move or expand from just FP&A to also taking on what we call different BizOps or strategy and ops functions. And one interesting thing about the fundamentals for us, at least, was we parked top line modeling or ACV modeling for the self-serve part of the business in product and engineering BizOps. And that's because it was a product led growth. And then we put the nascent enterprise top line ACV model in sales success and strategy ops. So initially, you're just building out, again, 0 to 1 processes. And in product and engineering BizOps, you're building out that first kind of self-serve model. You're just trying to get some go-to-market metrics readouts built. In sales strategy and ops, had a very strong team there that started really nascent carving territories, setting up quotas, putting together a deal desk, even working on the commissions piece. And then in marketing, just really starting out, trying to figure out what we're spending and what the ROI might be. It then, and I think you wrote this in the blog post, but really important, those don't change. Those are continuing. Hopefully you're getting a little better and a little faster at those. And so you move from those fundamentals into the trust and partnership. And again, I think that's where you'll take a little bit of what was built in the fundamentals and do it faster and just start to make it a little more complex and better. In the FP&A world, what we started to see was the ACV forecast that came out of the product and engineering BizOps for self-serve and out of sales and success for enterprise. That was ACV. And then it needed to be translated into billings and then into revenue. And that's where your FP&A team was really, really helpful to partner with those two. And it was kind of neat to all be under the same umbrella. So that became increasingly seamless. But again, those forecasts, that's where the complexity started to get built out a little bit a year into this process. And that's where also we started to provide, I think, not just reporting value, but real insights, and basically just said, look, if A does this, B does that. It sounds so simple, but I think most people would nod profusely in this business that just getting that data and getting it reported in a way that was helpful and allowing you to build those insights was really important. And then on marketing, again, Slack at least had two businesses, if you will, the kind of self-serve product-led growth and then enterprise. They certainly were gray in between. But for marketing, you had to start to feed an enterprise engine, and that meant getting into pipeline generation. And so you had the fundamentals, the trusted partnership. And then I think we use the term seat at the table, whatever you want to use, but that's getting a little closer to really making those earlier processes scale, making those forecasts more and more accurate. And you can see that all the way through, whether it's an FP&A where the forecasting has gotten much tighter. You really are able to look very quickly at a cash forecast and a P&L forecast. You're able to tie GAAP to non-GAAP and just a lot of public company readiness things. And then in the self-serve or product and engineering, you really are able to start to provide those insights that a true cohorted kind of pipeline model will show for a self-serve business. And then sales and strategy, I think you're getting much better at benchmarking, providing a lot of value there, and really getting into, quite frankly, pricing and packaging, both with self-serve and sales and success. And finally, in marketing, I think at that point, you're a critical partner with the marketing team in helping really understand how the MQLs are working, how you're scoring the leads, and also identifying, quite frankly, marketing programs spend on sales versus PLG. But never a really clean break, always seemingly building on a foundation. But you can just see how that seat at the table layer, there's a lot to it that you probably can't even do if you don't have some of those other fundamentals built.
One of the things you talked about in some of our earlier conversations that really resonated with me is it's not always about building for perfection. Sometimes perfection is the enemy of progress. And in those early stages, it's just about doing the best you can at territory carving. If that has to be a simple spreadsheet where you're uploading leads into a workbook for reps to take a look at, that might be an approach. But just getting from, like you said, 0 to 1 is important. Then you start to learn and optimize and continue to work on those through time because they're never done. There's not such a thing as complete. You'll always come back to them.
Yeah. And I think building on that, that's where some might call it CYA, but it's a little bit more of just expectations management. I mean, you're often building out an amazing ELT, a leadership team that's fantastic, whether it's a CRO, a CMO, CPO, CTO. And they're often coming from companies where this stuff was really built out. They had amazing reporting, they had amazing insights. And so it does take a little bit of, if not educating them, just walking through what do we have and what do we don't have. And we're all going to have to hold hands about how we're going to get to where you want it. Because a finance or a BizOps team oftentimes can become a little bit of an area that catches some flack. And I've always felt it's important for people to know, we know what the gold standard is. A lot of us have seen it. A lot of been a part of it. It just takes a little while to build up to that. And so if you're moving from a very mature company to a smaller company, that just comes with the territory. And that's why your finance and business teams are scrambling so hard to get to 0 to 1 and then to build past 0 to 1. But there has to be a little bit of patience or at least understanding that that's what's going on. And the only way to do that, I know it's beaten down, but is you're communicating like crazy, sharing what you got, sharing what you don't got.
That concept of planning or having a plan is so critical to all of this working. How did you go about having that plan in place to say, here's where we need to start at the sort of fundamentals level? And that looks different across the various teams that rolled into you, I'm sure. But this is our starting point. Here's where we need to get to in the long run. And these are the steps that we need to hit or the milestones that we need to cross along the way to get there. You first began at Slack. What did some of those early planning exercises look like? How were you communicating that back to the team?
Yeah, I think some of it's almost indicative of how much time you spend on it. That first few months, I mean, you are literally, I hate the drinking from the fire hose, but you are just trying your best to stay afloat. And so you might be working a half hour, an hour into your day once in a while where you put together a couple slides and just say, look, in year 1, after 12 months have passed, we've got to be here. And in year 2, this is where we should be. And in year 3. But I don't think it's too much more complex than trying to look out a couple of years and just say, look, in a really ideal situation, where would we be? And so that's what we would spend time doing. Again, early on, probably not as much time as we should because we were just trying to stay afloat. But if the team can start to walk through, look, here's what we saw at other companies that worked. Here's what we have, and here's what we don't have to get there. And we saw that in a year, in 2 years, in 3 years. And that includes adding to the team and growing the team. It can't become, just the few of us working together and build that alone. But before you know it, it starts to get a little more detailed. And you do build out a really neat plan and a roadmap to have the end goal in mind and then start to come through with how you should hire towards that end goal and how you should chunk it out. And so that was just a really important piece to it. And like I said, we didn't do great early on because we were, I think, just somewhat overwhelmed. But as time passed and we built a little bit of space into the system, we did a much better job at building that. I also had the benefit, a guy named Eli Weiner, who was doing sales strategy and ops on the team, Neil Shaw, who was doing product and engineering, sales ops. I mean, they were awesome at this and really helped not turn this into, I want more headcount, but rather, hey, here's where we want to be in a year or 2 years. Let's agree or disagree. And here's how we think we can get there via headcount. So that was really helpful.
And if you were to kind of go back and do it again or in another role, would you have spent more or less time in that upfront planning? And I only ask the question because sometimes it's just so easy to kind of be stuck in we need to just get through this week or we have all these requests that are coming up and you can just find yourself spinning. So just in the spirit of maybe someone who's like doing this for the first time, what advice would you give them there?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it'll come as a surprise, but the more you can build it a little time into the system to do this, it can just get you out of these rabbit holes where you just feel like you're spinning just to keep up. If a forecast is due every week, if all of a sudden, oh, the 409A needs to get updated. Oh, hey, we might want to do a tender offer. I mean, these things are coming at you all the time. And, to your point, you can just keep doing that all day and spend the whole day doing that and weekend and night. Or on occasion, you can find that hour or two to just start to map out where you'd like this to go. And quite frankly, it can be somewhat invigorating or at least make you feel like you're not in quite a rut to see where this thing could go. And so early on, I wish I had done a lot more of it. Easy to say now. I didn't really have a lot of time to do it, but I would just encourage anyone doing this and building out these teams and feeling very 0 to 1, try, even if it's on Saturday while watching sports or watching whatever you watch, just try to build a slide, just saying where you think this could be in a year or two. And before you know it, it does get a little more manageable to think it through and to make a very good case to build the team, bring in some outside consultants, things like that, where it becomes somewhat of a no-brainer because you really thought it through.
We talk about trust and partnership as a stage in the hierarchy. Like, would this kind of planning that you're doing be an opportunity to kind of be vulnerable with the stakeholders you're working with to say, hey, here's where our team is in each of the functional areas we support. Here's where we want to get to. Do you sort of see it the same way? And here's what we think we need to get there? Or is it more of a, no, we need to plan internally. We work within the finance organization to do that. Or was it kind of sharing those ideas to see what might work?
Yeah. So in the FP&A side of the world, there was a little bit more of local knowledge. So you would walk through with folks whether it was your, head of technology, head of product, what you'd like to be able to provide vis-a-vis reporting and analysis. And I wouldn't say they rubber stamped it, but they often agreed. Where they would come in pretty hot is just saying, look, I need a finer cut of the data, or I need a better way to track this or that. And so that was FP&A. Where what you alluded to really was absolutely a partnership was on more of the biz ops or strategy and ops side, where, your CRO for this sales and success strategy, or CMO or CPO, really, sometimes it didn't even take a separate meeting to sit down. You felt some heat coming in pretty quickly and you knew pretty quickly what they needed or expected. And again, that just got back a little bit to not probably having to figure out some mystery about what they wanted, but rather figuring out how you were going to get there and running through with them. Here's how long it would take. And here's some alternatives. If we perhaps add to the team or de-emphasize that project, we could get you this quicker. But again, that communication piece, it sounds redundant or many times a little bit overwrought. It is so vital, particularly to the ELT and their direct reports, to just say what we currently have and what we think we can get them in X amount of time.
How often would you check in on this sort of like long range strategic plan for the team? And how far out realistically were you planning?
Yeah. So I think like any other functional team, you always had your kind of private spreadsheet about your see your headcount, what you were hoping to accomplish over the next quarter or two vis-a-vis open recs or asking for a few more recs. So that I think was just a constant, and every person on my team had one. I certainly had one. I think where it became a little bit further out is we would have some planning sessions as a leadership team, or even in our weekly, where we would dedicate some time, not every week, but certainly at least once or twice a month, and just say, where do you think this thing is going? And it usually, quite frankly, a great disciplining mechanism is headcount. It sounds, kind of in the weeds, but really that is the way I think oftentimes you start to measure what you think you might be able to provide and when. And so it's a great discipline to talk about, look, give me your quarterly headcount plan, give me this year, and then let's talk through a year from now. Now, a lot of the team has the end goals of what they'd like to provide and what they'd like to do better. But there is nothing more disciplining than walking through a headcount plan, which then turns that into a reality and puts a roadmap together.
I just wanted to see if there's any parting advice or wisdom you might give to any other folks out there trying to do this at the early stage.
I guess one thing that I don't know, maybe it's as you get older, but don't worry too much about the boxes and arrows of an org chart. Do what you can, again, to deliver on those fundamentals. And those things about who owns what and where people sit and their remits, they often will work their way out, particularly if you're the team that focuses on the task at hand. You can often take on more responsibility if you want it. But I would just argue, get to work and deliver on those fundamentals. And again, those org charts will take care of themselves, and your remit also will take care of itself. That sounds a little bit somewhat petty advice, but you can often, I think, spend a lot of time game playing where things might go in the org or where your team fits in the org. And again, if you just start to deliver on those fundamentals, people are going to pull you in just naturally. They're going to want your help because, as we said earlier, and you pointed it out, by just the act of building out these various 0 to 1 plans, you become really good at it. You become a knowledgeable person who they need your help. And so if you focus on that, the other stuff will take care of itself, would be one piece of advice.
Yeah, people are attracted to problem solvers.
Yeah. And then the other one, the data. I can't tell you how painful sometimes, and I don't think it's specific to me. I think a lot of others would not profusely. It's really hard sometimes to get the data in a workable format. It seems to be the answer is the data is always there, but how do we get it in a way that we can take it and work with it to start to provide those insights or start to make better forecasts? And so just constantly thinking through how data is ingested, how it's reported, the teams that are responsible for it. I would just say you just cannot believe how important that is to this team's success.
That's great advice, especially from someone who's been there and done it a few different times. Matt, just want to say thanks again for the time and sharing this with the operator community.
You got it. Thanks, Chris.